historical significance, that is how to mobilize American industry and for democracy worldwide. Now, on December 29th, 1940, nearly a year before Pearl Harbor, President FDR made a very interesting conversation, fire chat, to the nation, and in which he probably said something that's very famous for that series of chats with the nation. It shows you a leader must convince a nation the importance of Americans' role in global affairs. In that fire chat, he uttered the phrase, America should be the arsenal of democracy, which basically tells us several things. Number one, that America is a democracy. As a democracy, we have enormous inspirational power for the people outside of the United States. So do not forget that. That was meant to combat the rampant isolationism at the time. But most importantly, he says it's an arsenal. Arsenal means that we are going to provide the necessary tools of war against aggression, against tyranny, the enemies of freedom. And that was many, many decades ago. And today, we're facing an entirely different international situation in which that the primary enemy of democracy and freedom is China. China is not an ordinary country, not just with a parochial ambition for regional supremacy. China is a country destined and determined for global dominance. And not only with that strategic intention, China also is capable in terms of industry, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of the military capabilities. So that's why the nation needs to have a major understanding of the importance of Americans' role in global affairs. And I think President Roosevelt made very clear that he is going to lead the nation to the fight that's worthwhile. Secondly, it's also about actually mobilization of America's industry. We say United States is a free market economy. Free can also means freewheeling. So it's not really organized. America is run by a lot of corporations, very powerful corporations. Nevertheless, it's not nationally mobilized and concentrated. So we need also a moment of 1940, 1941. When I say 1941, mostly I mean the March 1941 when Congress passed the landmark Lend-Lease Act. And 1947, I mean that the National Security Act that really restructured American industry, restructured Americans' defense and the intelligence establishment to combat the central issue of the time, that is a threat from the Soviet Union. So here, we're not just talking about history, we're talking about reality. And today, we're very, very fortunate to have just a superb panel of experts on this very issue in the new environment that we are dealing with, particularly from the perspective of U.S.-China relationship. And leading to this panel is a very familiar face to America. I mean, he's Scooter Libby, who is the distinguished fellow here at the Hudson, and he's a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he served as chief of staff and a national security advisor for Vice President Dick Cheney from 2001 to 2005. And he's a principal deputy undersecretary of defense for policy from 1989 to 1993. So Mr. Libby will moderate today's events, and I'll let him to basically take over and introduce our distinguished panel of experts. Thank you, Scooter.
Thanks again for that kind introduction. A stark question gathers us here today. Will America be able to defend itself and supply its allies in a prolonged future war? The tragic war in Ukraine has had many casualties, first and foremost, brave Ukrainians. But there have been others, including the illusion of a durable peace in Central Europe. Not least among these casualties has been one that would have surprised and astounded America's World War II generation and the generation that followed it. That casualty has been America's reputation as the reliable and redoubtable arsenal of democracy in the face of a prolonged challenge to freedom. Modern war demands courage, leadership, sacrifice, and massive amounts of munitions and sophisticated weapons systems. These in turn require supply chains and extraordinary production efforts. Aiding Ukraine into its second year of war has raised questions at first and then doubts about America's capacity for the timely production of such arms in a major and lengthy conflict. The tensions today in East Asia portend that such a storm might arise in coming years. Before these winds, the warning flags hoisted over Ukraine stream westward. Our adversaries see them. They, our allies, and our potential allies strain to see our response. 6 centuries ago, Machiavelli aptly warned that a state's preparedness, or lack thereof, affects its fate. We have seen that lesson time and time again in intervening eras. This week marks the 50th anniversary of the Korean War armistice, a war well noted in China and largely ignored here. America was not ready for that war. Our adversaries perceived an opportunity, and in the initial onslaught, our forces, including the legendary Task Force Smith, suffered horribly. We do not want more such losses on the periphery of Asia. We do not want more ugly stalemates or worse. Our adversaries then could not strike our homeland. Our adversaries in the coming era will be able to. The question that brings us here is whether America of the 2020s can adapt to the challenges as well as America of the 1930s and 1940s did. On the eve of that conflict, the United States was not a major arms manufacturer. Indeed, the American public generally shunned the arms trade. But within a few years, the Americans had armed both themselves and their allies. Neither the situation nor the capacities of our allies, or ourselves, or our adversaries are the same now as they were then. But perhaps we can draw some useful lessons. Under the auspices of Hudson's China Chair, I want to welcome to Hudson our guests here today and online. We are indeed honored and fortunate to have with us 3 of our country's foremost experts on what aided and complicated the timely manufacturing miracles America performed over 80 years ago. With your indulgence, I will introduce them and pose some initial questions to them, and there will be time, we hope, towards the end of the session for audience questions. Let me start by introducing Mark Wilson, professor of history at the University of North Carolina, seated in the middle. He is the author of Destructive Creation, American Business and the Winning of World War II. He is currently working on a history of the U.S. military-industrial complex since 1950 as an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. And his focus on defense production is not new, as he studied this as well with regard to the American Civil War. Professor Larrie Ferreiro, sitting far to my right, is a naval architect, historian, and author, most recently, of Churchill's American Arsenal, the partnership behind the innovations that won World War II. Larrie first came to my attention as the 2017 Pulitzer finalist for history with his book, Brothers at Arms, American Independence and the Men of France and Spain Who Saved It. I can personally attest this is a terrific book on the arms, financing, and forces that France and Spain provided which won an earlier world war, which we tend to call the American Revolution. He served for 40 years to the benefit of the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the Department of Defense. He's currently a professor of history and engineering at George Mason University in Virginia and the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. Finally, my colleague and good friend, Arthur Herman, the senior director of the Quantum Alliance Initiative here at the Hudson Institute. His research programs analyze defense, energy, technology, and industrial security issues. He is the author of 9 books, but most importantly today, Freedom's Forge, How American Business Produced Victory in World War II. The Economist named this one of the best books the year it came out. Others of his works include a New York Times bestseller, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and his remarkable To Rule the Waves, which looks at the industrial developments that fueled Britain's rise to naval prominence in the 18th and 19th centuries. He's a frequent contributor to commentary in Mosaic, the National Review, the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, and others. I will pose an opening question to Arthur and then one to each of our panelists, and then we will go into follow-on rounds. Arthur, I wonder if you could give us an overview of the arsenal of democracy, or Freedom's Forge, if you will. What was it? How did it serve the war effort? And what made it possible?
What made it possible? Thank you, Scooter, and thanks for all of you for coming, and thanks also to our audience who are joining us on the stream here at Hudson. And thanks also to my fellow panelists, who I think will help to expand the discussion and the initial remarks that I'll be making about that arsenal of democracy. This is an appropriate time to be talking about this because the paperback edition of my book, Freedom's Forge, came out 10 years ago. And it's always been a source of interest to me and gratification that the book year after year seems to almost grow in terms of its relevance, certainly in terms of the demand for people at higher and higher levels at the Department of Defense and elsewhere who insist that they want to read the book or are told you have to read that book to find out about just how the United States was able to mobilize for a modern mechanized warfare on 20th century terms from basically a standing start. How was that possible? Well, that's what I wanted to do with the book, was to lay out kind of an overview of how that remarkable miracle was able to take place, the building of the arsenal of democracy. And I think the most important lesson to learn from all this is that the original arsenal of democracy was not easy. This was a major effort, all of government effort, as we like to say today, but also an all of industry effort in order to go from a standing start in terms of where the U.S. armaments industry was, or even where America's military capabilities were, to becoming the greatest military industrial complex in the world. And I really wanted this book to really explain just not both how difficult it was and how we were able to mobilize exactly those factors that would make it possible to carry out this otherwise stupendously impossible transformation. And one of the first things I wanted to do in the book was to, and mention in this talk is to overthrow the idea that this was something that happened overnight as a result of the attack at Pearl Harbor. And very often that's the picture you can get from newsreels or from summaries that come out from popular histories and so on, that bombs drop on December 7th, 1941, and suddenly America's factories and shipyards and production facilities shift full gear into making armaments and arming the United States for war. What I showed in the book was that, in fact, the mobilization effort began a year and a half before that, in the summer of 1940, when President Roosevelt realized that the impending collapse of France under the Nazi blitzkrieg assault could also mean the fall of Britain, that seemed more than a likely possibility, and that the fall of Britain would now bring the possibility of Nazi influence and control of the Atlantic, thanks to control over the Royal Navy. That this was going to be an unacceptable situation in which to face. And when Roosevelt interviewed then Army Chief of Staff George Marshall about what would happen if we found ourselves under attack from Hitler, and Marshall told him, well, actually, right now, this is summer of 1940, mind you, right now, if Hitler were to land 7 divisions on our eastern seaboard, there would be nothing we could do to stop him. That basically he could roll all the way to the middle of the country, and we would have no forces, no ways of interfering with that. It's that conversation and others that gets Roosevelt then thinking about how do we mobilize in order to face that possibility. How do we take a U.S. Army, which is at the time number 19 in the world in terms of its size, and bring it to be able to fight a modern mechanized warfare on the terms in which Germany and Britain are now fighting it today. And the way in which he did it, as I explain in the book, is that he did it by turning to private industry. And in particular, one of the key figures in the book, General Motors CEO Bill Knudsen, and to ask him how we in the world are going to be able to do this. We have the greatest industrial plant in the world here in the United States, but it's been devoted to producing consumer goods and a range of other finished materials, certainly not to producing weapons. Those are being made in a handful of government arsenals. They're being made with a handful of companies that service the very minimal needs of our military services, the Navy Department and War Department. What are we going to do? And what Knudsen did was to give Roosevelt a proposition. He said, if you give me 18 months and give me the team that I need from industry and leading figures in industry, I will have more war material than pouring out than you'll be able to work with. Give me 18 months. That will be the requirement. And what I describe in the book is how that was done. First, from ordering new machine tools, from redesigning industrial plants, building new plants, handing over military plans and equipment designs to major corporations. Knudsen was very, very insistent that the biggest American industrial corporations, the ones with the largest numbers of engineers, would be the ones that would be most adept at shifting to producing wartime equipment from producing civilian industrial goods. 18 months, and of course, as it happens, that 18 months turned out to be just about on target. And it's 18 months from June of 1940 to the bombs dropping at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. The point is that the United States was already in production, wartime production, first to arm its ally, or its soon-to-be ally, Great Britain. That was the first step of war readiness, but then also to arm itself, not just to fight a war in Europe against the Nazis, but also to fight a war in the Pacific against Japan when the bombs dropped. And the output was unbelievable when you think about where we started and what happened here. We're talking about an output of over 350,000 warplanes from the summer of 1940 to the end of the war, right, in August 1945. 345,000 combat aircraft. In the summer of 1940, Roosevelt had told the press that he wanted to have a war mobilization that would make it possible to produce 50,000 planes a year. And all of the aviation experts scoffed at him. It's a fantasy. You'll never be able to do that. Well, actually, they hit that number by the end of 1942 by mobilizing private industry in this way. 1,100 warships of all sizes and types, including 141 aircraft carriers. By 1944, American shipyards were producing 8 aircraft carriers a month. At the end of next month, I'll be talking in New Orleans to an event hosted by Huntington Ingalls, who are the big shipbuilders, as you know, for the Navy and so on. When I give them that figure, 8 aircraft carriers a month, their heads are going to explode. They won't be able to deal with it here. 88,000 tanks, 250,000 trucks, 250,000 artillery pieces, 2.5 million machine guns, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. That's billions with a B. All of it coming out of American factories, all of it enough to arm 2/3 of all the equipment used by all of the Allies during World War II comes out of the American plants in it. And how did they do it? Well, that's what I want to suggest to you is that the key to this was the ability to mobilize private industry. Roosevelt, the New Dealer, the inveterate enemy of American business as a presidential candidate and as a exponent of the New Deal, realized that this was one in which he had to put aside politics and embrace this capacity of American industrial production to produce unheard of, unprecedented amounts of material that would go with it here. Turning loose the private industry that would go with it. Look, industry, commercial industry, business is about making things happen. I'm going into like the metaphysics of a defense industrial base, okay? It's about making things happen. That's how you build a business. That's how you build an industry. That's how you run a plant, right? The same is true for warfighters. Warfighters, their whole mission is about making things happen when they're called into action, when push comes to shove. The role of government and bureaucrats, and I mean corporate bureaucrats too, is about making sure things don't happen. That's their job. And when they're confronted sometimes by that energy that comes from private industry or that comes from the war fighters, give us what we need, we're in desperate straits, we need something right now, they tend to be a little put off by that energy and drive. Their effort is to slow things down, make sure everything works properly. And that's a good thing. That's part of the role of government, making sure things don't happen. In World War II, that was part of what Roosevelt and the administration was doing, making sure that something didn't happen, namely that Britain lost the war. That was the real impetus for the building of the industrial mobilization before the United States was involved in the war. But the key then to a defense industrial base, and I get asked this question all the time. Over the last 10 years, people will say, we built this magnificent arsenal of democracy then in 1940, 41, 42 in the war. Could we do it again? Could we do it again? And what I have to say is always is that it depends. It depends on whether we're able to put together the drive and energy and innovation of private industry and bring it together with the energy and drive of warfighters, of those who are going to need and use it. And the role of government in making sure that that intersection takes place in ways that doesn't dissipate or lose out on that kind of an energy. The other thing, and this is my last remark, other thing I will mention here is the other important thing about this is when I ask the question about could we do it again, and my answer has always been, because I'm an optimist, my answer has always been yes, we can, but we can't do it alone again. The world has changed. The world has changed in terms of where our industrial production and manufacturing base is today versus where it was in 1940 and 1941. That's a very obvious difference. It's declined a great deal. The other difference is that in 1940, 41, 42, we didn't have to worry about global supply chains. Everything we needed to mobilize for defense industrial production was right here in the United States with a handful of exotic materials that were required, but which came from places like in Latin America where U.S. states already had strong links and connections here. That's not the case today. And so when people ask me, could we do it again, I can say, yes, we can, including with the most advanced technology and systems coming, but we can't do it alone. We're going to have to find ways in which to build the strong alliances that'll make that sort of industrial miracle happen again in the face of the challenge that lies ahead.
Thank you, Arthur, for that introduction. Let's turn to Professor Wilson. Arthur mentioned the leadership of the executive branch and the military jumping in to get this going. But surely there was a greater U.S. government role as we went forward. Some funds had to be appropriated. Some departments had to work with them. I wonder if you could talk about the broader U.S. government contributions in order to get this private sector work going.
Great, thank you. Am I mic'd here? I want to start by thanking Miles and Scooter for guiding our discussion today. Thank you. Thanks to Shane, Larry, and others at Hudson for putting this event together. Thanks to Arthur and Larry for including me in the conversation, and thanks to the audience for being here. I'm going to try to talk for about 7 minutes, and forgive me, I'll occasionally read from my paper. And I'm going to start by reading a few lines from the conclusion to my book, Destructive Creation, which was published 7 years ago. Does the record of the industrial mobilization for World War II, I asked in the conclusion, offer any significant lessons for policymakers in the 21st century? One lesson I suggested was that, quote, difficult challenges can be managed successfully with creative approaches, combining contracting with robust regulation and targeted public enterprise and investment. Perhaps the rise of China as a military and economic power will force American policymakers to ponder this issue, I wrote. I continued, if American policymakers had applied the lessons of World War II mobilization to the toughest challenges of the late 20th century, people around the world would be better off today. I wrote that, quote, a rejection of targeted governmental action has delayed, if not prevented entirely, an adequate response to a major environmental crisis. Similarly, ideology limits the American public health system in its ability to respond to pandemics and other major challenges. So those were words that I wrote about 8 years ago. And I'd love to spend another 3 hours reading to you from the book so that I could give you a sense of what I meant by all that. But today, for the purposes of the panel and given the strengths of my fellow panelists, I think it may be most useful if I say just a few words about one specific part of what I talked about in my book, which is somewhat distinct from what we get from the really valuable contributions of Arthur and Larry. And by the way, I think all three of us agree very strongly about the pre-Pearl Harbor story that Arthur laid out so well in the introduction. And their books rightly call attention to the very important work of business leaders, engineers, scientists, and transnational cooperation. My book, in contrast, says a lot more about the massive public investments in military industrial capacity. During World War II, U.S. military and civilian governmental agencies spent nearly $20 billion on new defense plant, far more than what was invested by the private sector. This amounted to a major nationalization or semi-socialization, if you prefer, of the U.S. weapons industry. It extended far beyond the new government monopolies in the synthetic rubber program and the atomic bomb project, which some of you are reminded about by the new Oppenheimer movie in the theaters today. It wasn't just at Oak Ridge and Hanford where the enriched uranium and plutonium were made that the government invested massively in new plant. By the end of World War II, the government owned about 90% of the aircraft industry and the shipbuilding industry. To manage and operate most of this plant, as Arthur suggested at the beginning, the government depended on experienced for-profit companies, including Ford, GM, Chrysler, Boeing, Lockheed and Douglas, DuPont and GE, and many others. The arsenal of democracy was in large part a GoCo arsenal, government-owned and contractor-operated. So why dwell on this point about government investment in World War II and how might it be meaningful for policymakers today. I think it's important because it speaks to an aspect of the relationship between capitalism and security that still isn't discussed enough today, a kind of elephant in the room. Certainly, the armed forces of the U.S. and its allies have long benefited greatly from industrial capitalism, as Arthur's and Larry's World War II books show quite well. But I think we need to recall that there was and there is a fundamental tension, conflict, misalignment between capitalism and security. Capitalism chases higher returns, which are often not easy to find in the business of creating the public goods of national and global security. During World War II, when the U.S. wanted to increase the output of things like aircraft and ships and tanks that Arthur described earlier by a factor of 10 or more in a matter of months, it became clear that for-profit companies and Wall Street would not provide the needed investment. So the government stepped in. In the 1950s, the private sector started to invest some more in military industrial capacity, but at the same time, the government continued to buy new defense plant. So during both World War II and into the Cold War, the United States, in some sense, worked around the fundamental problem of the misalignment of capitalism and security by maintaining a semi-socialized defense industrial base. Today's defense industrial base, as you know, relies more heavily on private capabilities and private investment. Since the early Cold War, the Pentagon, Congress, and contractors have developed a new kind of defense industry in which public investment and public capacities have diminished, while contractor discretion and private investment are more important. This transformation, which was driven by a combination of pragmatism and ideology, has provided some welcome cost savings and other conveniences. But as events of the past few years and months seem to suggest, as Scooter was hinting at the beginning, this more privatized arsenal seems to suffer from supply chain fragilities and insufficient reserves and stockpiles. So, to wrap up, the main central question I wanted to raise for our conversation this afternoon is this: might it be the case that the U.S. has moved too far away from the high levels of public investment and in-house capabilities that characterize the defense sector of the mid-20th century? In recent years, we've heard a lot about the need for the defense sector to attract more private capital and leverage private R&D and commercial technologies by reducing red tape and reforming budgeting and acquisition. These conversations are important. But in this rhetoric that dominates most of today's discussions, we hear comparatively little about the basic problem of the ways in which capitalism and security can exist in conflict or be misaligned. So I propose that some of the relevant World War II history suggests that the structure and capabilities of today's U.S. defense sector may be massively suboptimal. And that's in part because we've forgotten that to get the kind of military and security that we want, we as the public need to be willing to invest in it. So thanks for listening. I'm going to stop for now, but I hope we can talk more about this in the Q&A, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Ferreiro, let me turn to you. Arthur has teed up the issue of the Allied contributions to the war effort in World War II, and that was the focus of your book. So I wonder if you could talk some about the nature of that contribution and how some of it manifested itself.
Okay, thank you. And I have some slides to assist me here. Again, thank you very much, Scooter. And if you open my book, you will see that there are many references in Churchill's American Arsenal to the works by Arthur and Mark, and I'm very pleased to be able to thank them personally for all the contributions to the understanding that came with their research, their scholarship, and certainly helped me greatly. Arthur had spoken about the importance of American industry and American capital in developing the American arsenal. Mark has spoken about the government role. I'm going to talk about the third leg of this tripod, which is the international cooperation that allowed this to happen. And there was a special relationship between the countries, begun really by FDR and Churchill, that extended beyond political and beyond fighting at the front, and extended all the way to the home front and to the industrial side. Arthur had spoken about the industrial ramp up prior to Pearl Harbor. It's important to note that a lot of the money that was spent to make these factories go away from either closure or manufacturing products mostly for commercial use came from overseas, came from the French and the British as they were under attack. Massive amounts, when I say massive, battleship loads of gold were sailing across the Atlantic, bringing the bullion to the United States and Canada for safekeeping, and that gold was being used to buy airplanes and other goods, including the Merlin engine, which you see in the middle, from Detroit. By the way, the same battleships that brought the gold also brought the plans for the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine so that the Americans could build it. They shared, the two nations, once France was out of the picture, resources at not just the military, as I said, but also on the industrial side. And it was an industrial scale cooperation. There were people from Britain working in the United States, people from the United States working in Britain, and the two sides cooperated in order to create this arsenal of democracy. Many of the things that appear in histories of World War II typically suddenly show up on the front lines without any mention of how they were created. The Liberty ship, the P-51 Mustang, the decoding of, decrypting of the Enigma machines, tanks, landing ships, weapons, all of these were actually developed originally in Britain and brought to the United States, and with cooperative engineering and manufacturing built in the United States at industrial scale. Many people think of the P-51 Mustang as the iconic American fighter, except it was built with British money to British specifications by a German-American engineer with help from a British aerodynamicist, and was powered by a British engine. So it was very much a cooperative effort. The Sherman tank involved a lot of British engineering. The same was true for the Liberty ship. The same was true for the landing ship tank. And this was for a very good reason. Britain had been thinking about fighting in a war for a decade, had actually been fighting for 2 years. They brought a level of expertise and knowledge and battle experience that the Americans simply did not have. When we talk about that ramp up from almost nothing to 60 miles an hour, and then 100 miles an hour, and then 200 miles an hour in the space of just a few months, it was because we benefited and adopted and adapted the experience from overseas and were able to incorporate it into our building programs. But Knudsen and the other leaders were only able to build what were already on the drawing boards. This was a fight against an enemy that was technologically, technically, and scientifically extremely capable. And the leader of the scientific efforts to get the Allies up to par with Germany was a man named Vannevar Bush, who said World War II was perhaps the first war fought in human histories where the decisive weapons were unknown at the beginning of the conflict. And if you look at the things that were developed cooperatively between Britain and the United States and a couple of other allies, I don't want to exclude Canada, incredibly important ally. It's just that Canada and Australia happen to have been part of the British Empire at the time. So please use the word Britain to be all-inclusive. Well, I haven't actually seen Oppenheimer yet. That's on my to-see list. But the trailer did not show anything to do with the fact that the atomic bomb started as a British project. The very first atomic bomb program was authorized by Churchill. The knowledge of the atomic bomb, the basic physics of the atomic bomb, came from Britain to the United States, and the British scientists in the Manhattan Project played leading roles. They were front and center in the development of the atomic bomb. They were also front and center of the development of airborne radar, the TIZARD mission, which was on a previous slide. British scientists came to the United States with Churchill's authorization to open up the crown jewel box of the inventions that Britain had been working on for a decade, including airborne radar and the cavity magnetron. And all of you know about the cavity magnetron because if you heated something up in your microwave oven this morning, it's powered by a cavity magnetron. That's what allowed radar to become this device that went from just being on the ground to being in the air. Anti-radar countermeasures, chaff, the proximity fuse, which Patton described as winning the Battle of the Bulge, all based on, that one was based on radar technology. And even penicillin. Many of you have heard the story of Alexander Fleming finding the mold penicillin in a petri dish. Well, it took a British scientist coming hat in hand to the Americans asking, how can I make this petri dish mold into something that can be produced at industrial scale? And of course, the Americans stepped up to the plate, specifically the beer and whiskey industry, because it's yeast, it's fermented, and the same methods that were being used to make beer and whiskey became the processing plants for penicillin. And that was how the Americans and the British were able to, side by side, develop these systems and weapons and inventions that had not existed and collectively won the war. So what does that mean for today? Well, the good news is that my associated university, George Mason University, happened to have just come out with a report called A Build Allied Approach to American Security. I had nothing to do with this, but it came at a fortuitous time. Arthur said it very well. We can't do this alone. We have allies with whom we work with and can probably work with even closer today. Just to take some of the most obvious things in terms of developing allied, producing allied, and sustaining allied. The American, Australian, UK pact recently for submarine production, but many other things. We have other potential allied powers. If we think about China and the Pacific, there are other Pacific nations that we work with now, but we can certainly work with much closer. France is a Pacific nation, Japan, Korea. And finally, because we're talking about wanting to expand the way we develop, produce, and sustain, the idea that cooperative programs should be focused more on cost savings has to be thought about as maybe taking second place. If you talk to any supply chain manager today, the shift is from just in time to just in case. And that's how we should be thinking about the way we work with our allies, less about cost savings and more about robustness and reliability and just in case scenarios. Thank you for your time, and I think this is a good opportunity to go to questions. So with your permission.
Thank you, Professor. As a scuba diver, I'm wondering if any of those battleships loaded with gold sank
No, they didn't. It was a fairly small, for a battleship, which I used to work on as a ship designer, they carry several thousands, tens of thousands of tons of ammunition. So they were able to take a few hundred tons of gold and not break a proverbial sweat.
Not one waiting for you at the bottom. Sorry on that.
Sorry to be so
Off the Atlantic.
transparent
No,
about it.
no.
So, Arthur, you and Professor Ferreiro have highlighted the importance of an Allied contribution, but that raises issues of industrial security in an era of considerable Communist Chinese Party espionage. How do we square that circle? I know you have looked at this with regard to allies such as Japan. It's clearly going to be a challenge for people who have, the golden nuggets of their secret technologies, which they hold close to their breast. So,
Right, and then you also have the issue of IP and protecting intellectual property, particularly for commercial companies whose very existence depends on having exclusive access to their industrial property. And as Mark has talked about in his book, this was a ongoing battle during the building of the first arsenal of democracy as well. On the one hand, and I highlight this in the book, there's this effort to sort of pool resources, including IP, among companies that were rivals and competitors, for example, the automobile industry, and that was at the broad level, the large level. But of course, at other levels, it's like companies. We surrendered our IP. When do we get it back? When do we get to resume our exclusive access to the inventions or to the plans that we alone have devised here? So that's another one of the factors with it. Look, when we're talking about this issue of how we go about working with our other allied, particularly democratic allied countries, who have the high-tech expertise and who are already in many cases working on the very same high-tech arsenals that our Department of Defense and our defense companies are working on, hypersonics being a classic example, but and unmanned systems being another. Obviously, there's going to be a range of very complicated issues that have to be addressed and have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. I can also commend the report, the study that your colleagues did at George Mason. I think it's a very good overview of the mechanisms, the many mechanisms by which it's possible to build this kind of arsenal of democracies. That's the term I like to use for it, in which the U.S. and democratic allies work together on advanced as well as conventional weapons systems. Here, a range of them, from export controls, technology transfer agreements, co-development arrangements between private companies, et cetera. And I think in many ways, the landmark accomplishment here on the part of the Biden administration, to give them credit for what can be done, was the AUKUS agreement, the agreement that was worked out between Australia, the UK, and the United States for building the next generation of nuclear submarines for the Australian fleet. What's interesting about that agreement, too, is that it goes beyond the usual arrangements, which tend to be bilateral for these kinds of arrangements, co-production, co-development arrangements, to one that it's a trilateral arrangement. And that's the kind of direction I think we want to move, is go beyond bilateralism between the U.S. and Japan, U.S. and France, U.S. and UK, U.S. and South Korea, to increase the number of players and those who are involved in it, and those who are bringing their input and their productivity, as well as their innovation, to the problems and issues you're dealing with. But the question of industrial security is one then that really needs to be raised. In the case of AUKUS, it wasn't really an issue. There was a fundamental trust that both the Australians and the UK had in place an industrial security system to protect data and to protect intellectual property, though different from that of the United States, that was at least equivalent to it. With some of our other democratic allies, that's more of a reach. And that becomes one of the factors that has to be overcome. It's not a permanent obstacle, but it is a speed bump in terms of developing an arsenal of democracies that would have to be addressed. But not always, not in every case. When looking for a trilateral or even a quadrilateral agreement, let's say between the United States, Japan, the UK, and India, there are ways in which to divide up the labor involved, the production and development of such systems, in which there can be appropriate levels of industrial security that each player in the arrangement can meet. It's by no means an insoluble problem, but it's one that's going to complicate this issue. It's not one that existed in the case of the arsenal of democracy the first time around. The level of industrial espionage conducted by the Germans and the Japanese tended to be at I'll say ludicrous level by comparison to what the United States would face during the Cold War, or what they face today in dealing with China or Russia for that matter here. So obviously it's a matter of concern. It's one that has to be addressed in major ways with certain types of systems going forward, but it's not a dead end by any means in terms of technology transfer and co-production, co-development arrangements.
Well, yes, I want to take a point you just brought up and provide a gentle coda. There was definitely a mistrust between the Allies at the beginning of the war, before the United States entered into the war. Britain and the United States were not in a special relationship. They were in a unique relationship, but they would call it anything but special. And specifically, the British were very worried about revealing to the Americans their crown jewels, the things that they had been developing, radar and the aircraft, because they didn't know what America might do with it. And the Americans were very worried about revealing our trade secrets to a nation that, and I think, Arthur, you said this very well, we were not certain if Britain would even exist after France fell. So there was mistrust on both sides. And it took the direct action of Churchill specifically with FDR to break that deadlock, to say, yes, there's mistrust, but we are going to make this work. And it needed that higher authority to insist that whatever problems there were had to be solved before that logjam could be broken up. And I think the same is true today. We certainly worry about transfer of technology. We certainly have many impediments to being able to work directly with our allies. That report Arthur just mentioned, that I mentioned by George Mason, lists some of those impediments. I wrote them down, so I didn't have to memorize them. The Jones Act, which stops ships from being built overseas, the Berry Amendment for textiles, Buy America Acts, which really is sort of in the face of security arrangements that we want to make, but also export controls, ITAR, the Arms Export Control Act, Technology Security Foreign Disclosure. These are all laws and regulations in place to stop the leakage of American know-how and technology. But keep in mind that trust and mistrust goes both ways. Just as in World War II, our allies also have, frankly, reason not to be completely confident of the United States. It was not that many weeks ago that a National Guardsman released secrets onto, and I don't remember which particular social media platform it was. So there is reason for concern on both sides, and it will require a high-level agreement among these allied nations that whatever problems we have to find a way to make this kind of cooperation work.
What you're really saying, isn't it, that trust is a matter of practice, not just a matter of principle.
Absolutely.
Let me direct this next question first to Professor Wilson, but I hope you both will jump in. One of the things in your book, your excellent book, is that in March 1936, Gallup took a poll, and it came up showing of 100,000 Americans that 82% were against the arms trade. That doesn't start to turn around until 1938. You get Munich and you get private discussions with President Roosevelt, who then starts shipbuilding and aircraft building. And then not until the dramatic month of May 1940, when France is falling and Britain might fall, do we get the conversation that Arthur was talking about earlier between the very respected General Marshall and President Roosevelt, who had himself been a Navy secretary. The next crisis may not give us that type of warning and lead time. Can we expect the United States government to turn around in the way that you all have indicated in our day-to-day as we proceed forward and as things move more incrementally into a future at which a problem might come?
So tough question. I think, one of the things I want to steer away from today is trying to pretend I'm an expert on present day supply chains, but I think there is actually, I don't think we've talked about this too much yet. I think one interesting question is whether we've already turned a corner to some extent in American politics and public policy in the last few years, a kind of bipartisan turning toward more concern with the security of supply chains, building allied, and so forth. It seems to me as a historian of the United States, there's some ways in which, there are indicators that the kind of political consensus and even, political elites have kind of moved away from the neoliberal preferences that characterized a lot of the last half century. So I think I think it's an interesting moment in which I don't think that we're in a 1936 situation anymore, if you will, right? There's kind of more interest in doing some of this. I mean, one thing, I'll just follow up on the remarks I had earlier. On the other hand, I think the part of what I was trying to suggest is that there has been over several decades a lot of inattention to a lot of the things that we're concerned about today. And I reflect on the differences between the 1950s, which is a period I'm writing about now in the book I'm drafting, and say the 1990s and 2000s in terms of the behavior of corporate leaders and their priorities. In 1956, the president of Boeing, Bill Allen, came to Washington and gave this kind of bold statement about how Boeing deserved more profits because they were doing good stuff with their profits. They were reinvesting most of their profits in both military and civilian high-tech R&D and developing incredible new products. In the last 30, 40 years, the truth is a lot of our top defense contractors have been just sending all their profits back to shareholders, right, via dividends and stock buybacks. And so it's a pretty big generational shift. And I would say, Congress, the Pentagon, and industry have kind of fallen short by historical standards over the past generation. But as I said before, I think there is a sense of maybe turning away from that. I'd be curious what the others have to say.
It's an interesting point. If you want to get a flavor of what it was like being in Washington, D.C. before the Arsenal of Democracy got started, this goes to your point. Great place to start are the diaries of George Spangenberg. Spangenberg served on the Navy Aeronautics Board for 35, 40 years. I mean, the first Navy aircraft he worked on was the Grumman Wildcat, the F-3F, Wildcat. The last one he worked on was the F-14 Tomcat. That's a career. That's continuity of career. But Spangenberg came to work at the NAB in the summer of 1939, just before war breaks out in Europe. And when he comes to the old Navy building, you know, the old executive office building where it was, and so on, it was the case that for the U.S. Navy, that it was not recommended that officers wear a uniform in Washington, D.C., appear in civilian clothes, because wearing a uniform smacked of militarism. That was the political climate on the eve of World War II, and the eve of building the arsenal of democracy and all the other aspects that we're talking about here. So we're definitely not in that space. And I would say we have a defense industrial base, which is still, I would argue, the best in the world, and is recognized as such even by our rivals. Still, you know, first-rate defense companies and contractors, but it's got its problems, it's got its issues. And in fact, when Spangenberg, began in the late 1960s, he began to get worried about what he was seeing, which was the tendency for the armed services, particularly the Navy, to spend more and more to buy fewer and fewer aircraft and fewer types of aircraft as well. And that the contrast between World War II and the early years of the Cold War, in which you had multiple versions of a plane to accomplish missions, the element of redundancy. If you can't fly one, then you can fly the other. And that as the cost went up, the time to develop and produce grew longer and longer. So already by the late 60s, he was beginning to be concerned about where this defense industrial base was going and where it was headed. And that's, of course, one of the problems that we have today, is that you have systems, very complex systems, that the military has come to depend upon, which are overloaded with requirements for all the services. That raises costs and that makes production run fewer and fewer. The other problem, of course, we have was our recent history. And that is that after 9/11, our priorities shifted, didn't they? And our thinking about what our military should do, about military doctrine, shifted to a global war on terror, to counterinsurgencies, and a whole range of expenditure of resources on the part of our military, which had very little to do, very little relevance to the kinds of conflicts that we face now, whether it's arming the Ukrainians and maybe ourselves, in the case of a fight over the Taiwan Strait, or with a larger global conflict with a near-peer rival like China. So that has also had an impact in terms of the neglect for our defense industrial base, in terms of production of large amounts of hardware and all the kinds of basic things, both for conventional systems and for future high-tech systems. High-tech systems demand manufacturing, you know? And this is one of the other illusions that came up, I think, over the last decade or so, too, which is that the world of high-tech systems would all be software-based. And would all it was going to be required was all algorithms. And the more sophisticated we got about designing our algorithms, or about how we conducted our cyber operations, then we didn't have to worry about actually what was manufactured or where. I think that was one of the problems that the third offset had, as a matter of fact, as well, was that the willingness to believe that commercial companies could do it all. It could figure it out for us, and would supply all that would be needed for it. So it's a number of factors that have come in that have made the American defense industrial base weaker and have more flaws and problems than ever before. But I don't think that they're insoluble. And there's certainly, in my view, there's certainly huge advantages if we look outside of our domestic defense industrial base to those of our allies for that kind of cooperation and work together on these systems.
I like the way this conversation thread is going. It's really expanding and making us think a lot more about what's happening today. And I'm glad you brought up third offset strategy as the progeny of the second offset and the first offset. And third offset, to some extent, I think you can argue that it's in progress. And I want to think about two aspects of this government, industry, technology, troika. What we're seeing in the Ukraine today is to some extent what some of third offset was trying to envision. One aspect is the greater and greater use of commercially developed, commercially available technologies, and we're seeing this in the battles in Ukraine today. The incredible use of civilian assets like UAVs and repurposing of other civilian technologies, and we are paying very close attention to this. The DoD stood up some years ago the Defense Innovation Unit, which is still trying to figure out how it's going to work with high-tech companies in order
and
DoD to make the two more compatible, to give that kind of openness to the way we're doing our operations. Instead of writing requirements and then building to the requirements, figuring out what is already there, what can be done, and developing I'll use the word doctrine, based on what we can already do. So that's one thread of the way the DoD is going to be, to answer Scooter's question, making itself more capable of meeting these future needs. But a lot of what the government and industry have to realize is that another lesson of Ukraine, basic old-fashioned kinetic warfare and firepower still make the difference on the battlefield. And it wasn't that long, it was actually last week that George Mason University hosted a conference about how we source these weapons, these basic, the basic materiel that we need. And there was an industry executive who said, and I wrote down his what he had. He was very straightforward. He said, when it comes to defense, the government's going to be paying for this one way or the other. It's either going to come out of our overhead or they're going to be paying for it directly. So the short of it is that capitalism is important, and we can rely on industry to a certain extent, but when it comes to defense, the invisible hand never picks up the check. So these will always be government responsibility, and we have to structure our responses to that.
So let me ask one more set of questions before we open it up to the audience. So if the audience wants to think about what they might want to ask. One of the interesting things that I've observed in Japan since the Abe administration has been an effort to conduct, in a sense, an informal audit of the technologies that are going around within the commercial world, and to see what developments might actually be applicable into the defense world. The question I want to ask of all of you is this. The perception is that the American manufacturing base has narrowed over the years, and particularly the defense manufacturing base. You know, this is an area of your study. If that is the case, and we are in a situation where the homeland is no longer secure from attack, where you might have cyber attack, biological attack, or kinetic even attack on some of our manufacturing, the key nodes on which they depend. That's what we study when we go to attack other states, and that's what presumably our adversaries are studying. How will we be able to overcome that obstacle, which did not appear so much in the World War II experience?
Redundancy. That is the anathema of industry. The thing that you don't want to see is something that is not producing an efficient process. And this, in a way, gets back to something I said about supply chain, but to some extent applies also to our, and I'll say defense manufacturing to include research, development, testing, fielding, sustainment. I think that the idea, not just for, by the way, attack by potential adversaries, cyber attack and so on, but what about attacks by nature? Because just to take medicine, a Pfizer plant was hit, was it a week ago? It was a tornado. And that put a dent in at least some of the production. So the idea that, critical industries, now we're talking about defense, but we might be able to apply that to other critical industries, may need some, what the military people would call defense in depth. Are there ways to be able to reconstitute quickly in the event that there is some adverse event either to the supply chain or to a direct attack? So if we're talking about environment, and one of my colleagues actually mentioned this in the George Mason University meeting, if you want supply chain redundancy, you may not want two plants in the same tornado alley or same earthquake zone, but you may want them geographically separated. Well, what can we do to think about how to get that kind of reliability? If we are thinking about in-theater operations, do we want some capabilities that are more forward, if we want to think about the Indo-Pacific region of conflict, which would include our allies in Asia, Australia, et cetera, that could not be as vulnerable to especially supply chain disruption. So I think this first idea of redundancy should be considered, again, not because it's going to get you more efficient, and yes, you're probably going to be looking at some increased costs. The question is that going to save you an unacceptable downside?
Larry mentions redundancy. I'll mention cybersecurity. That is, I think, the first line of defense. And that's the first and the easiest by which a competitor like China or Russia or North Korea, for that matter, would be able to disrupt and play havoc with a defense industrial base as well as our defense establishment. And so that's a very good reason why having the strongest possible cybersecurity standards, both for companies and also for government, becomes a fundamental part of protecting against the sort of attack that you're envisioning and that you're the scenario that you were put in place. Now, myself, I would speak, therefore, for the degree of quantum cryptography and post-quantum cryptography as being an additional layer of that cybersecurity protection. But look, let's put it in stark terms, shall we? What you're talking about in World War II is we didn't get strategically bombed. Our plants weren't subject to 4,000, 5,000 bomber raids like Germany's plants in the Ruhr were, and their large-scale synthetic fuel and their infrastructure, night after night, day after day. We didn't face that, our industrial base. Would we face a ballistic missile attack? That would be perhaps a less likely scenario than, let's say, an electromagnetic pulse. The possibility of EMP, which I think was dismissed as a fantasy just a few years ago in terms of discussion, now suddenly looks more and more, I think we've become to realize EMP could be a highly disruptive physical attack on infrastructure that could do damage in protracted periods of time and that needs to be thought about and protected against. One of those protections being redundancy, number one, making sure that your power networks have a backup, a plan B, in the case of such a massive physical disruption of what takes place. So I think your point is extremely on target about where the United States needs to be and where the our pride that we take in that first arsenal of democracy in our defense industrial plant here doesn't slide over into complacency about the physical threats as well as cyber threats that it could face from a determined opponent.
On target, no pun intended.
No, it probably was, but anyway.
Questions from the audience? Sir, there's a microphone coming your way.
During World War II, somebody like Kaiser Industries could throw up a manufacturing plant, PDQ. It did not take a 15-year lead-in to build the things that we build now. Is it possible to set up redundancy in any sort of reasonable time frame, or are we talking 2050?
Whether government owned or whether privately owned?
Well, I'll just say, as the audience and my co-panelists know probably better than I do, there's a lot of interest, of course, in moving faster today. And Congress in the last few years has tried to create new authorities to make that possible, to get stuff done in a matter of months instead of years. And I think we still don't quite, in my opinion, we still don't quite know how well that's working out. But there's a lot of interest and action in Congress and the Pentagon on that right now.
Well, one question I have, because I don't know the answer, is how long did it take the Tesla company to throw up its gigafactory for batteries? In Texas, I believe. I don't know where in Texas. It was not very long, and it is already producing many tens of thousands of whatever a battery unit is in a very short amount of time. So industry has shown that it can do that. I also want to throw out an important potential, and that's the existing arsenals of the U.S. Government, specifically the military. Certainly during the major conflicts, Korean War, Vietnam, et cetera, there were arsenals that, like not too far from here, a place called Indian Head, whose primary focus is on what's politely called energetics, which means things that go boom or go blast, but they had to set up very quickly second and third production lines for rockets and boosters and other things that supplemented the private production. And that had to be done, and it was done very quickly. So certainly on the private side, industry side, as well as on the government side, there is a history of being able to ramp up quickly. But it required, obviously, the very quick investment and the top-down determination that this is going to happen to make it so. So I think the answer to your question is, yes, it can. But there has to be that political will, and I'm using political with a small p, because even in a company, there has to be a direct political drive to get something done and make it happen.
Question in the back, please.
Sure, it's a question for Mark or anybody else who wants to weigh in, but I was curious. I know this panel is about World War II, but in 1950, 1953, the Army also faced a munitions crisis during the Korean War. I just wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that, Mark. What caused that? Maybe what does it say about the fragility of these industrial bases, how quickly they can ramp up, but how quickly they ramp down too, and how difficult it is to manage this?
Well, I'm not going to be able to give you a whole lot of specific detail about just the ordnance shortage in the mid-Korean War period, but of course, one thing I wrote about in my World War II book is the reconversion process. And by 1946, these same companies that we talked about, the aircraft companies, the weapons companies, are really in terrible shape, and they're all going bankrupt. And to some extent, the aircraft companies were already being revived in the late 40s, so they were in better shape. But if you consider other weapons manufacturers who weren't given that, that possibility, it's not surprising it took a while for them to get going. One thing I read about in my World War II book, and I think the others also do a little bit as well, we forget how uneven and variable and scattershot even the wartime production effort was. So I write a little bit about ammunition in World War II as opposed to Korean War. And there's incredible swings in the level of employment and output just in ammunition from a kind of early war ramp up to a mid-war decline. They kind of leave off for a while, and then around D-Day and after, they start to ramp up these factories again, and it's kind of wild swing. So it's kind of characteristic of the industry, I think, and that's one thing that makes it such a tough industry to manage.
But they're very fungible goods.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't require a lot of innovation.
The ammo.
Changes in ammunition. And let's face, in World War II, you had companies like General Motors that was impressed into service to produce ammunition, so on. I'm going to take a moment, use this as a pretext, talk about one other secret for that original arsenal of democracy. And that is that we knew who the target was, or at least the government did before Pearl Harbor, and that was Nazi Germany. All the production, all of the war material which was being produced was to deal with a prospective antagonist, right? Who was a real antagonist on the other side of the Atlantic for the British, but for us it was the putative antagonist. And part of the secret, I think, to having a really effective and expanding defense industrial is precisely that, knowing who your target is. And this was one of the challenges I think we faced at the end of the Cold War. Was it wasn't really clear who a potential antagonist would be. We were very close to China, after all. And so you had a lot of emphasis in terms of defense technology and capability, a lot of focus on capabilities as opposed to who would we be fighting against that would require certain kinds of material or certain types of systems that went with it. It was also one of the problems, I think, too, with a little bit with the third offset that Bob Work and Frank Kendall had. Again, it was capabilities-based. We've got all this great high-tech, know-how and new technologies. Let's build the new technologies and find out how they would apply, as opposed to this is what we need to be done, and this is how much time you've got to do it. When you have that kind of direction, this is the target, this is how much we need, and this is when we need it, go find a way to do it. That's one of the secrets that you begin to, again, go back to my point about releasing the energy, the drive, and the innovation that private industry can bring to a defense industrial base.
It's a very good point. Even after the Cold War ended, for some years thereafter, maybe to today, we had built our forces for the Central Front in Europe, and our airplanes lacked the legs, the wings, to get far enough for the Asian theater, and that remains an issue.
A legacy of the Cold War.
Any other questions from the audience? Not, let me, Shane?
Thank you. Shane Larrie with the Hudson Institute China Center. I just want to ask, this panel is focused on where we are in terms of our defense industrial base and where we were and our allies were. I wonder if anyone on the panel could speak a little bit about where our adversaries are today, particularly Russia and China, and how that might compare to Japan and Germany.
We're looking at you. That's okay.
Look at me. I'll field that question because I've been doing a fair amount of work on that with regard to both the Russian and Chinese industrial bases. And during the writing of the Freedom's Forge, I looked at, again, for comparative purposes, the German industrial base as well during World War II. And I think in all three cases, you see some of the advantages, but also disadvantages of a top-down approach to defense industrial base. and how that functions and how that works. I'll mention the Chinese in particular, because that is very much of a top-down system that they have built. The way in which the defense industrial base goes is there's every 5 years, there's a evaluation, review, sort of where they're going and what's taking place here. But every evaluation of the Chinese industrial base, which first of all has no limit of the money. I mean, that's one of the key advantages that it has is whatever you want, we'll spend it. Great advantage of a command economy is you've got money to do that kind of a thing. But every evaluation is also dependent on where the CCP sees the world. So, for example, the development of hypersonics in the Chinese arsenal is dependent on where China is vis-a-vis other nations in its state of industrial development. It's very much a Marxist-Leninist approach, actually. You know, what's the nature of the society, right, in which we function, and the military must be a reflection of where we are, and therefore that's where the investment will go. And so the Central Committee and President Xi in particular have absolute say over what is built next and where the defense industrial base is headed and where it's going. And that's an advantage in this sense, that every manager and every plant operator knows exactly why he's doing what he's doing, and that is because the party says to do so. So you don't have for example, inter-service rivalry. I mean, you do to a certain degree, but it's muted by the fact that everybody has to follow the big plan, which is laid out and set out every 5 years in the direction with it. What it also means, however, from a disadvantage point of view, is that there's no other input into how the defense industrial base or even the militaries get to see what the situation looks like and what the technologies are. You don't have competitive visions coming out of defense companies, for example. Although they're huge, they're vast, you don't have competitive strategic visions coming out of the services here, because they all know they'll be taken care of under the overall budget. You don't have independent think tanks like a Hudson sort of saying, this is what you need to think about for the next technology. In other words, if the Communist Party doesn't see it, it doesn't happen. The Russian case, you have an industrial base which is on the point of collapse. That's been going on for a number of years, basically since the end of the Cold War. It's an industrial base which has produced nothing new, has had no innovation or development of new systems or even improvement in systems in a decade or more. And now, thanks to the war in Ukraine, its industry, which has been built and dependent upon export, arms export. Russia's always been one of the global leaders, number 2, the United States, in terms of arms sales abroad, right? Now that's about to collapse. People they watch what's happening with Russian systems. They know they're crap. They don't function. They're not reliable. They're not up to date. They're not up to speed. Even the Russians realize that. I mean, they're using UAVs built in Iran. I mean, Russia used to be one of the pioneers in the development of unmanned systems. It's the systems that the Ukrainians have been military use were originally Russian systems. And now they're completely obsolete. So the collapse of export arms sales is going to have a huge impact, in my opinion, both on Russia's own geopolitical position in the world. In terms of revenues, that was a big chunk of revenues for the Soviet state, for the Russian state, and for Putin. But it's also going to have a catastrophic effect on the ability of the industrial base to sustain itself going forward here. What that also means is that there's a big opportunity coming for all of those countries which used to buy Russian, who are now looking at what's happening in the field in Ukraine and saying, we don't want that stuff anymore. Somebody should be in a position to take advantage and take that market. I may have some ideas about why that could work, but I'm not prepared to reveal right now. But I think there are ways in which we can see this as an important lesson for us of what happens when you have a defense industrial base which has become stagnant, which is no longer innovative, and in which, as government money dries up and investment dries up, which has been the case with Putin for the last decade, the amount of money being spent on new systems for the Russian military has been minimal, and becomes entirely export dependent in order to sustain its bottom line. What happens to such an industrial base? It's a cautionary tale in a lot of ways.
Let me offer my panelists a chance for a last word, if you have one, and if not, I can have the pleasure of, rare pleasure, of quoting Douglas MacArthur to Arthur Herman, who wrote a biography on Douglas MacArthur, and also refer back to the comment about the Korean War. In 1950, at the start of the Korean War, MacArthur commented, and Arthur, you're not allowed to correct me, that dictatorships have the advantage early in a war of unified direction and thinking. Democracies usually enter ineptly, but they do have the greater ability to correct themselves along the way. Well, one of the things we've been talking about today is, can we correct ourselves before a war starts and get ourselves organized for the coming challenge from China? So we thank the Hudson China Center for taking care of this and allowing this to proceed. And we thank the audience for coming, both live and those who will see it on video. Thank you very much, and a round of applause for our panelists.